Okay, now we're going to be creating some new distributions. So let's go ahead and open up our landscape B number 3, or it might be number 2, depending on the last save you created. I created a save of number 3 for when I was working on some of the different distributions. So I'm just going to load that in, and what I want to do is just reset the material. We're going to call this landscape custom D. And now I'm going to edit our terrain. And now what we're going to need to do is increase that pixel amount. So we can bring this up and keep stepping it up. We could also use the resize option to avoid all of the in-between generation. And we can go with 2048. Now this is actually a really large terrain. I am going to bring it up to 4096. And we're going to use the resample altitude to fit new terrain. And now it's going to draw out our terrain from our procedural, and this is going to take a little while. As you can see, it's moving very slowly, calculating that pixel data from the procedural. Whether or not you need this much detail is up to you. We could reduce this, but I want to make sure that I do have some of the peaks showing up and just really be able to take a look at the way the terrain looks. So I'm going to let this finish sampling and creating the terrain, and then when it's finished we're going to be converting it over to a standard terrain and going into the material and creating some new fractals for distribution. And this is still calculating. Rather than waiting for this to finish, I am slightly impatient. I am just going to cancel that just by hitting escape on the keyboard. We're going to edit the object, and I am just going to use 2048, which should be more than enough to really get the detail out of the terrain. It's still going to take a little while to sample this, but not nearly as long as 4096. Now, if you really do need that larger resolution, then you will want to just let it finish out at where it was at. But I do want this to be fairly quick and something we can get to working with as quickly as possible. For the most part, the detail is going to be there. Although not the really fine details, we should be able to get a pretty good representation of the procedural terrain from this distribution. So I'm just going to let this finish up, 2048, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so now it is done calculating. Once we perform the next procedure, which is converting this to a standard terrain, we are going to lose our altitude production from the scene. Since we are working with the landscape itself and no copy, what I want to do is save this function. And one folder I did not create is a functions folder. Although you could add that as part of the materials, I'm going to create a new folder called functions, and we're going to save this out. Which we'll make sure we call this landscape. And this is still from the A amount and the A scene because we haven't modified the landscape at all or this fractal. So I am going to keep it with the same name in case we do end up changing that A terrain, then we know which is which. So we're going to save this out, and now we have that function saved. Go to up at the top, we have this pull down, select standard instead of procedural, and now it's going to convert this over from our procedural function into a standard terrain, which is a polygon based, and a fixed polygon-based terrain rather than an adaptive polygon terrain. I also want to note, while this is still processing, that if you have any custom dependencies set up in that altitude production, they will be gone. So if you have materials tied to those, you won't be able to use that connection anymore, which is another reason we saved out that fractal, so we can bring them back later and connect any sort of material that we want to those dependencies or those fractals themselves by loading them in. And I did manage to crash view, so what I've done is reloaded the scene, and I'm doing this as a 1024 by 1024. During the conversion, it hit a little bit of a problem, which resulted in the program closing out. So in this case, I'm going to go with a lower amount, and we should have something a little more manageable either way. And if we zoom in, for the most part, this is a pretty good amount of detail. So let's go ahead and switch this to a standard. Hopefully get a little bit of a better response time from that. More than likely this was crashed because of the recording that I'm doing right now, and possibly from pausing during that. So it may not be entirely a view issue, so you may still want to try to get that higher amount. And I did actually manage to crash it again. So in this case, we need to look at doing this a different way, because it is going to be something you're going to run into at some point, since this process can be extremely helpful. Now, I did find that at the resolution of 512 by 512, it does work. But if you do need a higher resolution, I found that switching the mapping mode will allow you to perform the conversion without removing any of the current placement of the terrain or the detail. So what I want to do is edit the function and first delete all of these custom dependencies I have connected to our fractal. I'm also going to right mouse click on the altitude production, copy it, and paste it. And since we already have that saved out, we can always load it back if needed. I'm going to switch the mapping mode to world parametric, and I'm going to click yes. I want it to add the nodes to preserve the geometry. And now we can see we still have the exact same terrain. If we go back into the function, we can see what it's done to preserve what we have. And what it's done is taken a multiply and added in a constant vector. So it's multiplying our vector by this constant vector in order to get the output that we currently have and had before. So with this, what you should be able to do is increase the resolution, convert it without it crashing. That world mode will sometimes cause those issues. I'm going to stick with 512 since I've already spent enough time fixing this problem. Convert it to standard, and then we can take a look at the terrain. So now we have it in standard mode. I'm going to click OK, and now we can see the terrain in the scene. Obviously this detail is far less than we had from the procedural, but it is going to be a very fast response time. The render is going to look terrible, but we're going to be able to see the distribution of our fractals we're going to be creating, and that's the most important thing. So what I want to do is rename our terrain. Terrain B number 4. We're going to go ahead and save our scene as number 4, and just make sure we make a note. Proc is now standard. So procedural is now standard. And because we reset our material before, we've got the black and white gradient. I'm going to go to edit our color map. Just in case you don't have this black and white showing up, I'm going to show you how to just make that and work with the color map really quick. What I'm going to do is reset the color map. Now resetting the material will give you a black and white color map. Resetting the color map will give you a black color map. Edit the color, and what we can do is just click and move all the way over our position to -1, create a new key color, which is going to be black. Go over to the first color point, and it might be a little hard to see the color point on the bottom, but it is there. Right mouse click, edit color, put it to white, and now we have that black and white color. I also want to note, just when we go to edit color, if you I can see I have a very large color palette available. What you can do is edit your favorites and increase the number of columns in order to get more. Some people don't know about that, so I figured I'd just add that in. So that way you can expand the palette or decrease the size if needed. Okay, so now we're going to be using this color distribution to preview the distribution we want to use for our ecosystem. Our mapping mode is set to world standard, which is what we're going to be using throughout the entire construction of the scene, as we were using before with a scale of 1. So now we can edit our function, and we want to use this constant node that we have on the top of our chain, which is there to be replaced, and we're going to add in and replace by Fractal. So now, just like before, we have the black and white representing our population that we're going to be using, and we can modify this fractal and preview it on our terrain to see where the ecosystem is going to show up. Another thing to keep in mind is the more complex your fractal is, the longer it's going to take to populate the scene and render it out. So I'm going to keep with a simple fractal rather than using a more complex set of fractals because we are going to be blending with what we already had from the rest of the scene and the terrain generation. And I'm going to go to Perlin Noise, Gradient Amplitude, Edit, and just decrease our amplitude down to 0.8. And now we need to take a look at our scale. First I'm going to click OK, and what we want is a nice preview while we're working on this. Make sure our preview quality is set to fast, either that or standard, because we are really far away from the terrain. We might need a somewhat higher quality in order for the roughness to show up. Another thing to keep in mind is we might need to throw in a threshold filter because we don't want this smooth transition between the black and white. So what we do is take our filter that we have already between the connection and change this to smooth threshold. The threshold filter will automatically create a very fine line in between the black and the white. The smooth threshold is new to View 7 and allows you to create and set the transition amount or the fall off between the two. We can also choose at what level we'd like the transition to show up. Now we can already tell in the preview that this is obviously too small. Now for working a little bit closer, then this might be a good distribution, but for an overall distribution this is far too small. So what we want to do is increase our largest feature, and maybe our wavelength setting. Before what we were doing is using a wavelength setting of 10. So now we can increase that overall scale. We can see these nice patches showing up. I'm also going to move over our material editor off to the side so we can see this a little bit better. And I can also increase our metascale, make that a value of 30. And now we have a lot more variation. We'll go ahead and make it 50. We can increase our roughness up to 0.7. And the higher roughness amount we have, the better of a distribution we're going to end up with close detail and having some really fine amounts of roughness around the edges. We can also go into our smooth threshold and change the threshold amount, whether we want to reduce or increase what we currently have. Change the transition amount. So I'm not going to go too far into the detail of this and set up all of the different fractals. I basically just wanted to show you a good method to be able to design these fractals. And I just moved the main camera, so I'm going to undo that. But this is going to give us a very fast render. As you can see, as I'm rendering, it is a much quicker processing time than the procedural. So this way we could add our layers to that Photoshop file and create exactly what we want, planning it out ahead of time once again before we go into the population and the dynamic population, so we know where everything's going to show up ahead of time. What we can also do is, in this state, use our setup from our material and the procedural terrain fractals to build our material and ecosystem population with this scene in order to be able to get it done quickly, render it out fast, and not have to spend time refreshing the terrain or waiting for it to render with the quality being so high because of the procedural. So we can make changes, render it out, and set it up ahead of time. Now, if you want to save out the fractal itself separately, what you can do is copy the color production, paste it in the bump. When we edit the function, what we can do is remove the color to brightness that is created and the color map. Connect the bump to the threshold we created, and we could also remove the rest of this if we wanted to. But basically now we can save out this bump, save the function, and we have it saved and ready to load in as a distribution. So whether or not you're just setting up your individual sort of pre-planning noises, or you want to save out your final noise that you've decided you're going to use for the distribution. Also keeping in mind that we can set up a variety of distribution layers for each ecosystem layer we create. So you don't really have to put it all into one distribution. We can use bits and pieces on different ecosystem layers to distribute our plants or objects that we are going to be using for the ecosystem.